They reckon by the mid-2020s, again, estimates at times vary, for £1,000, you should be able to buy a computer that's got the same processing power as an adult human brain. In other words, you may find yourself at some point sitting in front of a computer that's as smart as you are. Not as attractive, not as in demand at the weekends, but as smart. Well, I mean, how's that going to feel? When you give this thing an instruction and it hesitates and says, well, I don't know, have you thought this through? I'm not sure you have. By 2050, for £1,000, they reckon, we should be able to buy computers with the same processing power as the entire human race. This is the natural consequence of Moore's law, which is about the exponential growth in computing power. My point is simply that from a technological point of view, all these gadgets that have revolutionized our world in the past 20 and the last 10 years are on the nursery slopes of the technological curve that we're now entering. By the middle of the century, it's likely the entire planet will have been transformed even further by these technologies. Now, we've already seen the consequences of this for work, for the economy, for the pattern of global trade. From a technological point of view, there's no question that the world is going through a revolution, which is comparable in scale to the Industrial Revolution. A big concern of mine, I work in education a lot, is that our education systems are still locked not in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. But it's not the only factor. The other big factor is population growth. There are currently, I think it's 6.8 billion people on the planet. That's more people on the planet at the same time than at any point in human history. For most of human history, we had about 1 billion people on the Earth, and we've now got nearly 7 billion. And half of those came around in the last 30 years. And this is a really interesting demographic shift to me, because in the old industrial economies like us, the population is declining. The real growth is in the emergent economies, and in the Middle East, for example, where something like 50% of the population is in their mid-20s or younger. So the whole world is tipping on its axis in terms of demography. But they reckon that if things continue as they are, we'll be heading to something like 9 billion people on the Earth by the middle of the century. 9 billion. There was a fantastic program the other week by David Attenborough. I don't know if you saw it. It was actually last year. It was called How Many People Can Live on Earth? It's a really interesting program. And the basic premise is, at the moment, there are something like 145 children born every minute. That's adds up to 9,000 an hour and 200,000 a day. And they're all born with the same expectations. They want food and water and clothing and a life, like you do. The trouble is, there really isn't that much water or fuel or agricultural land available. So the question is, what's the maximum number we can handle on this planet? And I'll boil it down so you don't have to watch the whole show. But the bottom line was that if everybody on Earth consumed at the same rate as the average person in Rwanda, then the Earth could sustain a maximum population of 15 billion. But of course, we don't all consume at the same rate as the average person in Rwanda. If everybody on Earth consumed at the same rate as the average person in North America, it said, the Earth could sustain a maximum population of 1.2 billion. And we're at 7 billion and counting. And people are figuring this out. And frankly, we only get away with it because they put up with it. And what we're beginning to see in the Middle East are people not putting up with it. So I think this is literally the case, that in our lifetimes, we will continue to see ever more radical changes in how the world is with itself and how it works. And it's why these initiatives are so important, not just for Derry, but more broadly. The second big theme is this. I believe myself that there is a kind of crisis, not just in the world's natural resources, but in our human resources, that most people have no idea what their talents are. I don't know if that's true of you. I mean, I wouldn't know. But what I do know is an awful lot of people go through their entire lives without ever discovering what they're good at, if they're good at anything. An awful lot of people don't like the work they do, if they have work. They just get through it and wait for the weekend. But I also meet people who love what they do and couldn't imagine doing anything else. And this is what this other book is about, this remarkable book, actually, called The Element. The expression is that, if people are doing something they feel naturally attuned to, it's just a common expression, is that they're in their element. It's really two things, I think, to be in your element. And I believe getting people into their element is a key strategy for the challenges that we face. To be in your element is two things. The first is that you're doing something that you're naturally good at, that you have a feel for. Have you heard of a guy called Bart Conner? Have you? Bart Conner lives in Norman, Oklahoma. He's fantastic, I think. He's in his 40s now. When Bart was when he was 6, he discovered that he could walk on his hands as easily as he could walk on his feet. Now, we don't know how he found this out, but he did. And he said it wasn't much use to anybody, but it was socially distracting. If there was a party at the house and the conversation lulled, his dad would say, "Bart, do the hands thing there," and the whole thing would pick up again. And then he found he could walk up and down stairs on his hands as easily as he could on his feet. Well, he said he didn't think much about this, but his mother did. And his mother, when he was 8, spoke to the school, and they arranged to take him to the local gymnastics center in Morton Grove, Illinois, which is where he lived. And he said he will never forget the feeling he had when he walked into this gymnasium. I said, "What was it?" He said it was intoxicating. I said, "What do you mean?" He said it was like a mixture between Disneyland and Santa's Grotto. I said, "How?" He said, there were wall bars, there were trampolines, there were vaulting horses, ropes. He said it was intoxicating. Now, is that how you feel when you walk into a gymnasium? Is it? Looking around, I think not, frankly. I mean, if I could speculate. See, I do not find it intoxicating to go into a gymnasium. In fact, I need to get intoxicated if I get within 5 minutes of a gymnasium. But Bart went every day, and because he loved it. And 10 years later, he walked onto the mat at the Montreal Olympics, representing the United States in the male gymnastics squad. He went on to be the most decorated male gymnast in American history. He lives now in Norman, Oklahoma. He's married to Nadia Comaneci. Do you remember Nadia Comaneci, the first woman to get a perfect 10 in gymnastics? They have a wonderful little boy called Dylan, after Bob Dylan. Why not Bob? We don't know. It's what comes of spending your life upside down, probably, but anyway. But he and Nadia run this amazing gymnastics center, and both of them are leading members of the world's Special Olympics movement. So they've helped to liberate the gymnastic capabilities of tens of thousands of athletes with special needs. Now, the two things about this are, firstly, that, of course, what Bart discovered at an early age was that he could do this thing. It was something that he had a natural aptitude for. And my conviction has been throughout my entire life that we all have deep natural aptitudes. And they're all different. There are things you're good at I couldn't even begin to do, things I can probably do that you wouldn't be interested in doing. That if we know anything about human life, it's that it's diverse. How many of you here have got 2 children? Can I ask you? 2 children or more? 2 or more. Well, I'll make you a bet. If you've got 2 children, I bet you they're completely different, aren't they? I mean, you would never confuse them, would you? Your 2 children. I mean, John will tell you, we're 2 of 7, and we're all completely different. We love each other, we love to be together, but we're completely different. That's the point, really. Human life is intensely diverse. And one of the points of diversity is our natural aptitudes, which differ enormously. One of the big problems with education is that we don't encourage diversity. We're obsessed with conformity. And we require people to be good at the same things, and some things in particular. And if they're not good at those things, they or we conclude they're just not good at things. And it may just be those things that they're not turned on by. So aptitude is a big piece of it. But it's more than aptitude. To be in your element, you have to be not just doing something you're good at, you have to love it. I know all kinds of people who are good at things they don't like doing. They just happen to be good at it. And they spend their lives doing this thing they're good at, not because they like it, but because they ended up doing it because they're good at it. To be in your element, you have to love it. One of my brothers, Ian, has been in bands his entire life. He's now in a fantastic band called Rumours of Fleetwood Mac. They were actually played recently. I think it was at the Odyssey, wasn't it? With the orchestra and choir there. It's a fantastic band. Years ago, he was in a band in Liverpool, and they had this great keyboard player called Chaz. I went to see them. I did not look then, by the way, as I look now. I was not the distinguished sophisticate that you see before you. I was into Led Zeppelin. Thank you very much. No, I was channeling Robert Plant at the time. I had the long hair, the leather jacket, and the jeans. I was almost frighteningly attractive, honestly, at this point, and a danger to women everywhere, honestly. It wasn't even a fair fight, really. It wasn't even fair. It's why so many of them avoided me, I think. When I walked into bars, they would scatter. I could see they just weren't up for it. But this guy, Chaz, was fantastic. And I remember saying to him at the end, I went over at the gig, as we call it. Those of us who live at the leading edge of cool use language like this, a gig. So we were gigging, and I went over to Chaz, and I said, "You were fantastic tonight." He said, "Thank you very much." And I said, "I'd love to do that." He said, "Do what?" I said, play the keyboards like you play them." He said, "No, you wouldn't." Well, I was taken aback, frankly, because I thought I would. And in any case, I was just socializing. I wasn't there to be interrogated, So I persisted the way you do. I thought I'm an expert in my opinions. I'll just carry on with it. I said, "Well, I would." He said, "You wouldn't." And we carried on in this way for some time till the barman intervened and said, "Would one of you move this forward?" So I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he said, I'm 25 now. I've been playing keyboards since I was 5. And I play 5 hours a day. I practice 5 hours a day. And I play probably 6 nights a week." He said, "And I do that because I love it. And I couldn't do it if I didn't love it." And he said, "If you loved it, you'd be doing it." He said, "I think what you mean is you like the idea of it." I said, "Don't you speak to me like this. I could be a distinguished person at some point." But of course, he's right. If I'd loved it, I'd be doing it. But that sense of passion, when you're doing the thing that comes naturally to you and feels most authentic, carries you through every type of obstacle. You can tell when people are in their element. One of the ways you can tell is your sense of time shifts. If you're doing something that you don't enjoy much, 5 minutes can feel like an hour, can't it? But if you're doing something that you love, an hour feels like 5 minutes. Your whole subjective experience of time alters. And at the end of the week, you might be physically exhausted, but spiritually uplifted by doing it. Whereas if you're doing things that don't resonate with you, you can feel physically okay, but spiritually depleted by the whole experience. And finding that point of resonance with your own authentic self, I believe, should be a quest for all of us. And we all have that sense of possibility, I believe. And it happens in every type of area. I met a woman on a plane once. I wasn't going to tell you this, but, it helps to talk, I don't normally talk to people on aeroplanes. I don't know if you do, Phil, or anybody else here does. I don't. I don't like being trapped into a random conversation on an aeroplane. Particularly if it's a long-haul flight, or even a medium-haul, like a 5-hour flight. Don't talk to me. I don't mind talking when we land. I don't. I'm quite happy to regret the 5-hour conversation we didn't have. I'd rather that than regret the one we actually had, for the whole 5 hours. I was on a flight a couple of years ago to Hong Kong. And from Los Angeles, that's a 14-hour flight. And as I got on the plane, I sat next to this guy, and you can tell when somebody wants to talk. You can feel it, can't you? People start fidgeting. You can feel them trying to find their opening line, so you can bond. And I thought, don't do this. It's a 14-hour flight. I don't want to talk to you. Anyway, I was wondering what his opening line was going to be, and I was sitting there, and at the plane, they hadn't even closed the door of the aircraft. People were still loading up. And anyway, the killer line eventually came out. He turned to me, and he said, "So, you going to Hong Kong?" I said, "Yes. Yes. Yes, that's why I'm on the Hong Kong flight. In fact, we're all going to Hong Kong, all of us." So one thing that brings us together in a common purpose. Interesting to get to Hong Kong. Talk to them. There are 500 of them. Go and talk to one of them. Anyway, I got my book out. I was reading Moby Dick. Somebody has to do this stuff. So I sat reading Moby Dick. I thought, that'll deter him. Anyway, 2 minutes later, he said, "So, you're reading Moby Dick?" I said, "Yes." So I went to the toilet. It's the longest I've ever spent in a toilet, actually. 14 hours it was altogether. But I did finish Moby Dick. Anyway, I got chatting to this woman as we were landing on a flight into Florida. She's a beautiful woman, in her 40s, I should think. I didn't know what she did. I imagined she was probably in the fashion business, just the way she looked. But anyway, it turns out she's a professional pool player. Her name is Ava Lawrence. She has a website. She's called The Striking Viking. And when she was raised in Sweden, north of Stockholm, and when she was 12, she followed her brother into a local pool hall, and she said she was captivated by it. And she went on to practice there every night, a bit like Bart at his gym. She became the regional, then the national, then the regional champion. And she eventually moved to New York, where she's based now, and entered the World Championships. This is over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. She spent her entire life playing pool. She does master classes, demonstrations. She started the first women's league in pool. And she said she finds the whole game entrancing, still, 25 years later. And she said what interested her is that at school, the thing she disliked most of all was geometry. She couldn't get her head around geometry. But she said, whenever I stand at the pool table, all I see is geometry. It's all about angles and cutting off corners. And she said, every time the ball is reconfigured, it's a whole new geometric puzzle. She said she now uses pool to teach kids geometry. But she says, and that's why I'm mentioning it, she said that even now, all these years later, she doesn't know if she's at the pool table, if she's been there for 3 hours or 20 minutes. She gets so lost in what she's doing. And you know that. If you get in touch with a process that speaks to you, your whole sense of being is transformed by it. I don't mean in some whimsical sense. I mean actually, you go into a different place with it. And I think our kids give us signals like this all the time. All the time. And you gave your parents signals too, things you were naturally drawn to, things that spoke to you. The thing about this, the reason I'm telling you about the Bart, Connor, and Ava stories is this. It also illustrates something else that's very important, I think, for this process here, which is that our lives are not linear. I think this is fundamentally important to recognize this, that life is not linear. It's organic. And I say this because most of our institutions are designed on the premise that life is linear. Schooling is, isn't it? Now, the idea is if you go right through the normal process and pop out the far end, suitably qualified, you'll be on track for the rest of your life. This has never been true. I don't know if you're doing with your life now what you thought you'd be doing when you were at school, are you? I mean, I'm not. I didn't think at school, if it all worked out well, one day I'd be hanging out here in Derry with you, kind of talking about this project. Life doesn't go that way. My son has been at the University of Southern California. And when he started there, we were given a briefing by one of the professors, the parents were. And he talked about his own son, who'd been at USC, I think he left 10 years before. And he said when his son started at USC, he wanted to major, as they say in America, in the classics. And he said, my wife and I are a bit worried about this, because we thought, what type of a job will he ever get with a classics degree? And anyway, he did classics for the first year, and he said, we were a bit relieved when at the end of the first year he came home and said that he decided not to do classics. He said, Mum, Dad, I don't know how to do classics. They said, why? He said, I don't think it's going to be much use. He said, oh, okay, great. He said, I think I'll do something that's more useful. He said, what's that? He said, philosophy. And he said, well, we pointed out that none of the big philosophy firms were hiring at the moment, like conceptual ink, And he said, anyway, he did philosophy for another year, but he finally majored in art history. And he said, if I tell you that now he's working for an international auction house, he travels the world, he spends his time with people he really likes to be with, he loves the work he does, and he makes great money. And he got the job because of his knowledge of art history, his immersion in classical culture, and the intellectual training he got from his philosophy programs. He said he was ideally suited for it. And it's that series of disciplines that made him look for that sort of role. He said, but if we'd said to him going in that, here's the deal, why don't you do classics, art, history, and philosophy? And you never know. 10 years from now, there may be an opening in an auction house, and you'll be ideally positioned for it. See, it doesn't happen that way. What happens is, if you invest in your talent or your children's talent or the talents of people you work with, they create opportunities that would previously have been hidden from them, that actually even weren't there. And that's the whole creative process. That's how cultures work, that you create possibilities that previously weren't available, and then you live in those possibilities and create new ones. Bart Conner, for example, seems to me a great example of this. His mother could have said to Bart Conner when he was 8, Bart, will you stop it with the hands thing? Like, we get it. You can do it, but the joke's over now. Get on with what you're meant to be doing. But she didn't. She encouraged him, and in doing that, he took the first steps, albeit on his hands, into a life that nobody could have predicted. And this is the point. His mother, though she encouraged him, could not have foreseen the life that she was opening up for him, could she? There's no way she could have thought, here's Bart, he can do this hands thing. There's this girl in Romania, and I have a Bob Dylan album. You never know. This could work. That's not how it works. You create your life. You compose your own life, and then you live in that composition. And you can recompose it and recreate it. That's the point. Because if we know anything about human beings, our essential gift is the gift of creative possibilities, the gift of imagination. So there's a revolution. I believe we can only meet this by thinking better of our own abilities and those of the people we work with, of our children. And the third point is, to do that, we have to create the conditions under which talent shows itself and will flourish. And that's not a mechanical process, that's an organic process. This whole City of Culture process will unleash possibilities that nobody here, none of us sitting in this room, can imagine. I'm helping to support and mentor a similar process in the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma is the youngest state in the American Union, and the first 100 years of its statehood really depended on its natural resource in the ground, its oil and the great agricultural resource of the state. They know that they won't sustain them into the future, that for the future, the real resources of Oklahoma are the people. And what they are finding, by the way, is that many young people are leaving the state because they can't see a future in the state. So what we're trying to do with the Oklahoma Creativity Project is to create a new sense of possibility for the people living there. I've also connected Oklahoma to this international network of creative states that I mentioned earlier, and I think that's a possibility here, by the way, for Derry. There's a huge opportunity, I think, for Derry Londonderry in this international framework. But what Oklahoma's finding, I remember I spoke to the governor about this, and he said, if we have this statewide program, where will all the ideas come from? And my conviction has always been, they will come from everywhere. if you're a creative leader, your job is not to have all the ideas. Your job is to create the conditions under which everybody has ideas, and they will come from everywhere. One of the things that's happened in Oklahoma now is that they've created a school of contemporary music, a rock school, essentially, modeled on the Brit School. And that would not have happened. There are now 600 students at this school. That would not have happened if this project hadn't been there, but nobody foresaw that as a possible outcome. That's been true of the City of Culture in Liverpool. All kinds of things have come from that nobody thought when they put the original planning documents together would actually happen. I live not far from Las Vegas. Who's been to Las Vegas? Have you been to the Venetian Hotel? You should go to the Venetian Hotel. The Venetian Hotel is a replica of Venice. It's on the first floor, there's a replica of St. Marco's Square. There's a canal. This is inside the hotel. Gondolas and gondoliers. I have been to Venice, and the Venetian is better. It is. It's more authentic, I feel, and it doesn't smell. Anyway, we went there a while ago. Terry, my wife, and I should have said this earlier probably, actually. I mean, I've had a long association with Northern Ireland. Terry's family are all from Northern Ireland, and Aidan McGinley and I worked together 10 years ago on the Unlocking Creativity strategy, so I'm a frequent flyer to Northern Ireland. I haven't just popped in. I mean, I'm here a lot. But so Terry and I, we've been together now for 33 years. I mean, can you blame her? Really? I mean, let's be serious here. Terry is a major fan of Elvis Presley. Actually, that's a bit of an understatement. There are 3 of us in this marriage, honestly. And fortunately, I'm alive, but it's a kind of marginal advantage. Anyway, 5 years ago, it was our silver wedding anniversary, so we went to Las Vegas to get married again at the Elvis Chapel. It was great. It was her idea. She wanted to be near him on this day of days, and I went along with her. Anyway, we had the Blue Hawaii package. But there are others. But the Blue Hawaii package, you get the Elvis impersonator, Adrian, 4 songs out of a possible 6, a hula girl, that was optional. I opted for it for reasons I was rather pleased about in the event. Who knew coconuts were so versatile? I had no idea, but... and smoke. That was the 4th bullet point. Smoke. That was on... And I was looking for it, in the middle of taking my vows. I thought, where's my smoke? We've paid for it. And just when we got to I do, there was this puff of smoke from an exhaust pipe just above the altar. It was lovely. For another $100, we could have had a pink Cadillac. But we thought that was a bit tacky. We thought that was lowering the tone of the whole occasion, frankly. But anyway, I mention it for all kinds of reasons, but one of them is this, that if you think of it, there is no reason for Las Vegas to be there. If you've ever been there. There is a reason that Derry is here. We were saying this at dinner last night. There's a reason that Liverpool is where it is. It's a natural harbour. Oklahoma City is in a great agricultural plain. Chester is in a place of natural defence. Most cities, ancient cities, are there for some strategic reason. There's an advantage to the place. None of this is true of Las Vegas. Las Vegas is in the middle of nowhere. It's a desert. There's no natural water supply. The place is full of scorpions. Nobody would think of putting a city there. And yet, for a number of years, it was the fastest growing city in America, and it's one of the most famous cities in the world. The only reason that accounts for it is that Las Vegas represents something that is unique to human beings. There is something about Vegas that only human beings are really capable of. Actually, that's true of a number of things about Las Vegas. So I'm not talking about pole dancing, for example. Although it is true, only human beings seem to pole dance, don't they? Have you noticed this? Other species do not pole dance. They don't. And you can't train them to do it, by the way. You cannot teach your dog to pole dance. Just take my word for that, would you? It's a waste of a weekend, frankly. I wish it would never bothered. No, what I mean is the power of imagination. Las Vegas is an idea, really, and It's an idea that has proved tremendously fertile, and people have been drawn to it. If you think of it, almost everything that's distinctive about human beings comes from this power of imagination, the ability to bring to mind things that aren't present. And from that flows all the extraordinary capabilities of creative work. Creativity is not the same thing as imagination. Creativity is putting your imagination to work. It's applying your imagination. There are lots of misconceptions about creativity. One is that only special people are creative. Actually, we all have deep and profound creative abilities. The trick is to nurture them and evolve them. Another is that creativity is about special things like the arts. Well, I'm an unapologetic advocate for the arts, particularly in schools. But you can be creative at anything, at maths, at engineering, at architecture, anything that involves your intelligence. And the third misconception about creativity is there's nothing you can do about it. You're creative or you're not. And actually, there's a lot you can do to make people more creative. And it's from that source of creative possibility that we produce this rich tapestry of human culture. The values and forms of behavior that distinguish different communities. So creativity and culture are intimately connected. Human culture is the outcome of these capacities. But it's about the conditions. And I have seen, in the work I've done the past 20 years, whole communities transformed. Phil will tell you about communities in Liverpool which have been transformed by giving them a new sense of possibility. Not far from Las Vegas is a place called Death Valley. Death Valley is the driest place in America. Nothing grows there because it doesn't rain. In the winter of 2004, it rained. 7 inches of rain fell on Death Valley. And in the spring of 2005, there was a phenomenon. The whole floor of Death Valley was carpeted in flowers. You can see this online if you Google it. Death Valley became a pasture for several weeks. Well, what it showed was that Death Valley isn't dead. It's dormant. Right beneath the surface are these seeds of possibility, waiting for the right conditions to come. And if the conditions are right, life is inevitable. That's how it is with organic processes. If the conditions are right, life will come. And if the conditions are wrong, life will hunker down. And it's exactly the same way with human ecosystems as it is with plants or any other natural ecosystem. Communities, if they are deprived of the right conditions, will hunker down and become hostile to themselves. If the conditions are right, people flourish differently. And I believe that that's what this whole city of culture process is about. Culture is an organic term. You can't predict the outcome, but you can create the conditions under which growth will happen. And then you have to see what you can do with the things that begin to emerge. But I believe this profoundly in all the work I've ever done in schools, with businesses, with the cultural sector, that if you invest in people's sense of talent and creativity and give them the tools and a sense of possibility, extraordinary things will begin to happen. And it always happens, and it's inevitable that it will begin to happen. The thing is, this revolution I'm talking about is essentially unpredictable in its outcome, and it's unpredictable because life is organic. It's not linear. I don't believe we can predict the future. There are some things we can predict, and we know when Halley's Comet's coming back, we know when the next high tide's going to be, but in the world of human affairs, very little is predictable. We can't predict the future, but we can help to shape it. We can anticipate it, and we can help to bring it into being. And I think if we get this process right here in Derry, if you get this process right in Derry, if you invest properly in the creative possibilities, the people, the children, the people of all generations here, you will create a sense of possibility here that at the moment is unforeseeable, but its outcomes will be fundamental. You will, I think, begin to see a harvest of creative work and creative achievement that you can't plan for, but whose riches eventually the whole city will benefit from. Thank you.